if you've been paying attention to the news, you'll notice that the memorandum of understanding that was signed by the U.S. and Iran last month is facing its greatest test after days of tit-for-tat retaliatory strikes. Iran hit commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz that tried to bypass Iranian navigation control by using a U.S.-backed corridor through Omani waters, which was a workaround that Tehran says violates the MOU, which of course puts Iran in charge, or supposed to put Iran in charge of arrangements for safe passage through the strait. The U.S. responded with 2 consecutive nights of strikes across Iran, hitting more than 170 targets. The bombings had killed, as of a few hours ago, though that number has likely risen, had killed 14 people and injured 78 so far. And Trump is, of course, threatening to reimpose the naval blockade that strangled Iran before the deal. And for their part, the Iranians have responded by resuming strikes on Jordan, Bahrain, and Kuwait, which they accuse of complicity in American attacks on Iran. All of this as the U.S. has canceled waivers on sanctions for Iranian oil. Trump, of course, declared yesterday the MOU to be over and called Iran's leader scum, though in the same breath he suggested negotiations could still continue. So it remains unclear whether the agreement has actually collapsed or if this is another Trump tantrum with a body count. But joining us to help understand what's going on is Erik Sperling, Executive Director of Just Foreign Policy. Erik, welcome to Breakthrough News Live.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it because, you know, as we all know, Trump changes his tune every week, sometimes every day. And there have been instances of him literally contradicting himself from one hour to the next. This week, he's decided to retry what already failed, which is pressuring Iran to buckle through military force. It didn't work 3 months ago, so it's unclear why he thinks it'll work now. And this follows, you know, this kind of seeming competition that we were watching between the neocon wing of the administration, led by Marco Rubio and closely aligned with Netanyahu, which wants to restart this war. And then there's the J.D. Vance wing, which kind of sought to wind it down, though it's worth noting it was Vance, who personally briefed senators to flip their war powers votes last month and who now is singing to the tune of more war to change Iran's behavior. So my question for you is, did the Marco Rubio wing win out here, or is this Trump lashing out because Khamenei's funeral drew millions while his 4th of July flopped, or is he just bored with diplomacy? How are you reading this shift back to war?
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, in general, I would say it's very much a competition for getting Trump to have reaction, you know, and which side can kind of get Trump to have the right reaction in the right moment. And I think it's been exhausting, I'm assuming, for both, you know, the neocons and the more restraint-oriented people on both sides. And I think clearly people saw Rubio was looking happy at the NATO press conference, and so it's not a good sign. You know, we know Rubio's been working. He's extremely faithful to this U.S.-Israeli defense, you know, elite, this national security elite, and he's definitely, you know, having success right now. I think what remains unclear is, you know, what Trump will ultimately decide. I think both sides are waiting to see, you know, how much pressure can Iran put back on the West and on the global economy. The neocons are hoping that they can just continue to drag this out, limit the impact to the global economy in the West, and then continue to see if they can erode that those military options that Iran has, while putting that indiscriminate economic pressure on the civilian population. So basically the same model. You know, I think there's a pretty big concern that Iran, you know, just may not be able to fully comprehend just how bad faith the U.S. is. I think they have a good sense of it, but, you know, I think a lot of people are worried about where this could go next, with Iran having somewhat limited options. They can escalate towards targeting the Gulf oil and gas infrastructure, but then things get very serious very quickly. So it's a really scary moment, and you know, I think everyone is concerned, I'd say, globally.
Yeah, and you're right to say it's a scary moment, and it's not only the different kind of currents within the Trump administration, the Rubio war hawks, but also the Democrats, who seem to be upset about the MOU. There were Democratic officials who mocked Trump for supposedly surrendering to Iran, and you warned at the time that this hawkish taunting would backfire. Now Trump is back to threatening to annihilate Iran unless it submits. So what is your message to those pro-war Democrats?
Yeah, well, this has been our focus at Just Foreign Policy. I'm here on Capitol Hill, which I'm sure your viewers would love this place. No, but in all seriousness, it's a bit dark because you do have Democrats who are very close, obviously funded by this U.S.-Israeli and aligned with this national security elite, and they have every interest in seeing Iran weakened and destroyed if possible. But they know that the American public, it's the last thing we want. And so this came out in some reporting by Dropsite and others that showed that, and I think this is logically just obviously true, that a certain percentage of hawkish Democrats want Iran to be destroyed, but no, their base won't allow it. And so I think that's the challenge is, we do see Democrats who are, who are saying they want to end the war, but when you look at the actions they're taking, they're actually trying to close political space. And so I think what we're working on now is to try to insist that people who want to end the war need to actually use language and employ strategies to create space to end the war. And so we'll see if this does calm down again, if Iran is able to if the balance of power brings it back to negotiations. Will we see these Democrats once again attack Trump from the right for surrendering, which is I think pretty transparently trying to close political space and make a deal less likely.
Yeah, it's really ridiculous and dangerous, as you put it earlier. And Iran also, as you mentioned, has limited options here because I think that this administration would be perfectly satisfied with just kind of having a partially reopened Strait of Hormuz sometimes, and then bombing Iran when they feel like it, which is the exact scenario Iran was trying to avoid. But, all that's to say, I want to ask you about the Iran War Powers resolution, because last month, after something like 9 failed attempts, Congress finally passed a War Powers resolution telling Trump to end this war, the House and then the Senate. But Trump was so rattled, he stormed up to the Capitol the next day, berated Republican senators at this closed door lunch, and then personally bullied 2 of them into flipping their votes to kill the second binding version. So can you walk us through what actually happened there and how much do these resolutions matter? Trump's team dismissed the one that passed as meaningless, but he clearly doesn't behave like it's meaningless.
Yeah, I think this is a strategy that genuine anti-war advocates have used and have pressured Democrats to use. And I have a camera issue. But it's a very much a successful, it's a good way to force Democrats to have to make an up or down vote. Where Chuck Schumer is hitting from the right and saying, criticizing him for diplomacy, but we force them into taking a position. You support the war or not? And I think that's a very positive thing because it required nearly all Democrats and eventually all Democrats to say, we do want him to get out of this war. And I think historically, when Trump has lost these votes, even back in 2019 in the historic Yemen vote that sought to cut off U.S. support for the Saudi coalition, even though he vetoed that resolution, he actually ended that support for the Saudis, and it really undermined the Saudi war effort, which essentially led to their largely their defeat. It's somewhat unsettled still, but they basically lost that war. And the cutoff in U.S. support was part of it. And so we've seen other examples recently with Venezuela. There was pressure. The administration had to promise they were not going to occupy Venezuela, and that led them to do a sort of a partial, the invasion, the horrific abduction. But they did have to promise Congress that they were not going to occupy Venezuela. So that was, in some sense, put some constraints. With this newest Iran War Powers resolution, I think there was a feeling that he was moving towards diplomacy. But I think the reality of this war, what we're starting to see, is that the type of diplomatic deal that's needed here would be just a devastating defeat for the U.S. and Israeli plans in the region. It would really endanger apartheid Israel's ability to sustain itself as an apartheid regime for a number of reasons. So I think we're going to see that this is going to be one of the toughest battles that we have, and that so I think the community here, the actual anti-war community in DC, and advocacy groups that are genuinely trying to end the war, we're pushing Congress to vigorously enforce the historic war powers resolution that was passed on Iran. And that's going to be with a number of different steps, including potentially taking the case to the Supreme Court to enforce it. But I think when you have a war that has overwhelming opposition from the public, where we just saw a poll that said 64% of MAGA voters want a deal to end the war as soon as possible. That's the MAGA voters. It's just I think when you have that opposition and you have Congress passing things, it puts you in a stronger position. But I do think it's going to be a fight against this really deeply ensconced Rubio Israeli-backed wing of the U.S. regime, if you will.
And then just to follow up to the war powers issue, the administration's legal excuse for ignoring Congress has been that these weren't hostilities, right? To remove U.S. forces from. It's not a real war. But then after 2 nights of, especially because of the MOU, but after 2 nights of these bombings on Iran, that argument is really dead. So does that change the math, do you think, for the next vote? And then especially with the backdrop of midterms coming up, that could actually flip Congress. In other words, is the administration's window for this war closing because of those 2 things I just mentioned?
Yeah, well, as J.D. Vance, I think, really said something concerning for everyone, which was that revealing this possible strategy of trying to get the oil out of the Strait so that it would relieve the pressure on the West and on the I think that's the concern. I think that's the main thing that's going to drive the urgency around it. So I think all these we're all becoming oil market following oil market analysts now because this is such a key part of the war. But I think that's going to be the key thing, and the faster those prices rise, the more Trump will have to be responsive to that. I think it'd be interesting to see. I'd be surprised if Iran alleviates that pressure again as easily as they did last time, because I suspect they'd regret that. So I think that's going to be the key. But I think the fact that hostilities are ongoing, it completely undermines their argument that there was peace, and it definitely takes away one of the excuses that senators and others were using to oppose it.
And your organization also championed Rashida Tlaib's war powers resolution to halt U.S. participation in Israel's war on Iran. Beyond the immoral and criminal nature of the war, you've argued that...
Lebanon, war on Lebanon. Israel's war on Lebanon, I think you meant. Sorry.
So sorry.
You said war on Iran. No, it's okay. Hey, the 2 fronts are connected, even if they say they're not. So...
Yikes.
Easy to mix them up.
We are. The war has overpowered our minds.
Happy Thursday.
Happy Thursday. It's Groundhog Day since February 28th. But no. Rashida Tlaib's war powers resolution on Israel's war on Lebanon. And beyond the immoral criminal nature of that war on Lebanon, you've argued that enabling it risks blowing up any U.S.-Iran deal. In the MOU, which hasn't actually officially collapsed despite Trump's crazy statements from the NATO summit, the first clause stipulates that the war on Lebanon must end and Lebanese territory must be respected, meaning no Israeli occupation. So can you connect the dots for our audience? How does the Lebanon resolution connect to ending the war with Iran?
Yeah, well, I think, once Trump has said to his team that he wants to pursue a negotiated solution or a ceasefire, then Rubio, he doesn't have total power to just overcome Trump and whatever his whim may be at the time. So Rubio and that elite in DC and Tel Aviv come up with strategies to undermine it. And obviously, one of the huge ones has been that they work with Israel and to try to perpetuate that war in Lebanon using this kind of perception that Israel has a freedom of action and that you have to manage Israel rather than what we know is true, which is that the U.S. could simply control Israeli actions by threatening cut off of the things they need to survive militarily, economically, politically. But so then they say, well, Israel's not willing, they kind of use that to try to undermine the deal and make it more complicated for Trump. And to the extent J.D. Vance is interested, for him, he has to get involved and try to navigate that additional wrinkle. And I think we saw that it was already repeatedly causing problems for diplomacy and impeding it. Then more recently, the one that just led to this current flare-up was, once the Lebanon war, wasn't enough, then they create a new route in Hormuz. So these are the different strategies they use. And so Rashida Tlaib did a historic war powers resolution to essentially force Democrats to weigh in, force not just Democrats, but everyone to weigh in on this additional war that's blocking peace. And so there was a similar strategy. And, it was remarkable that Democratic leadership, which certainly did not want this war powers resolution, they would have never, Democratic leadership was barely talking about Lebanon, because I think those that were aligned with AIPAC, with Israel, know that this is the best chance to keep this war going. That's they wouldn't say that, but I think that's what someone could conclude. Anyway, they all had to line up behind Rashida and support an end to the Lebanon war. So, I think that's the significance of it. It's obviously fighting against pretty powerful forces, but it was a historic effort by Rashida, and I think we're going to see that to the extent Lebanon continues to block peace with Iran, we're going to see that continue.
So since you mentioned AIPAC, I wanted to ask you about the not AIPACs, the supposedly progressive pro-Israel groups that have kind of worked to undermine efforts to stop arming Israel, but while using confusing language that places often all the blame solely on people like Netanyahu and Israeli figures to his right. And in fact, we just saw Rahm Emanuel go to Israel and give this speech basically blaming Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and it's all these crazy people for what's going wrong. And then, of course, Hillary Clinton was praising it. And I raise this to ask, what role are these types of figures, these kinds of liberal Zionists, playing right now in maintaining U.S. support for Israel while pretending not to? And why should people be paying attention to them?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting development. I think, from our perspective at Just Foreign Policy, we've been tracking something that even Lindsey Graham has been pushing for quite a while, which is this idea for those who are they're not just Israel hawks. There obviously are some maybe Christian evangelicals who really just care about that. But most of the U.S. national security elite actually cares about this grand strategy and essentially what they see as this incredibly existential war against, China, essentially, and which is aligned now with Russia and Iran. So, from our perspective, people like Lindsey Graham have been wanting to see a resolution of this issue in the Middle East so that the U.S. can kind of essentially unite all their proxies from Israel to the Gulf states. And so I think on one hand, it obviously shows that Israel's under a lot of pressure and that Democrats are having to find a way to message this issue to try to respond to that pressure. But on the other hand, I think we're a bit concerned about the ultimate goal of it. We saw that Rahm Emanuel mentioned that the goal is to create a unified Middle East that connects India to Europe in sort of an anti-China alliance. And so that's another part we've been concerned about. We think that really Palestinians should get to decide these questions, and we shouldn't be kind of predetermining what their status should be, and certainly not, giving them a state that is something, less than true sovereignty, unless that's what they somehow decide to do, which it would be a sovereign decision. But, I think so that's our concern, that really this is a strategy to sort of save Israel from this death spiral that it's in because of its demographic problems, because of its growing unpopularity. I think Israel is likely its most unpopular in the region in its entire history. So it's in a bit of a death spiral. And so we see this as an effort to try to save Israel, to save it as a Jewish state, and then also connect that to the broader kind of anti-China strategy. And so I think we're concerned by it, but I think people can also be happy to know that there's a lot of pressure on Israel right now, and it's definitely forcing people to scramble in the elite power centers.
Well, let's hope they keep scrambling, and let's hope the pressure continues. And luckily, it continues because of stuff that you guys are doing at Just Foreign Policy. So, Erik Sperling, Executive Director of Just Foreign Policy, thank you so much for joining us at Breakthrough Live.
Thanks so much.